Hey everyone, welcome to the next lecture. Today we're going to be talking about neoliberalism or neoliberal institutionalism, depending on the name you'd like to give it. So despite the name neoliberalism, so there are some similarities with liberalism that we saw last time. And the first slide that we'll look at will make some of those linkages apparent. But also when we're going through the slides, you're also going to see some of the assumptions are going to have some overlaps with neorealism. So this could be more, and there's going to be some kind of elements of the liberal tradition that we're going to be seeing, but also a heavy overlap with kind of some of the system level aspects that we saw when it came to neorealism. And part of that is going to be because again, like I talked about, a lot of the different theories we're seeing are inspired or in response to perceived weaknesses in neorealism. So there's definitely an element of neoliberalism is responding to some of those, taking kind of neorealism as a starting point and then trying to respond to some perceived weaknesses. And in part, it's because some of the similarities we'll be seeing in neorealism is that unlike liberalism, which focused on domestic politics, neoliberalism is a system level explanation for conflict and cooperation. So we've gone back up to the systems level. So we are down at the individual level when we did classical realism, shot up to the international system when it came to neo-realism, went down to the domestic level when we did liberalism, and we're going back up to the international system. All right, so neoliberal institutionalism focuses a lot on interdependence. And so again, kind of that linkage back into liberalism. So remember liberalism's third assumption, the configuration of interdependent state preferences determines state behavior, right? And neoliberalism focuses heavily on this interdependence. So what are the effects of interdependence on interstate action, on how states behave? So each state seeks to realize its distinctive preferences under varying constraints imposed by the preferences of other states. And patterns of preferences can be harmonious, conflictual, and cooperative. So we're going to be looking at what happens when, what happens in terms of state behavior when different states have harmonious, conflictual, or cooperative patterns of preferences. So neoliberal institutionalism is focused largely on how to achieve cooperation in an interdependent world, right? So given that in many, many different areas, we see interdependence, right? So the ability of states to achieve what they want depends on what other states want, the preferences of other states as well. So given that in many, many, many different areas, and this is part of where neoliberal institutionalism came in, was critiquing neorealism, saying you're not talking about interdependence enough, but in so many of the different areas, particularly outside of security, but even within security, but largely kind of they arose looking at international economics, particularly within international economics, and other areas too, like environment. And so many of these areas just talked about independence, right? Like states pursuing their own policies, kind of, and it doesn't matter what other states or preferences are, just doesn't really make much sense. And so neoliberal institutionalism emerged to see how do we achieve cooperation in an interdependent world. So what exactly does interdependence mean? So just going a little bit deeper on what interdependence means. So like anarchy, interdependence is a structural feature of the international system. So it feeds into when we talk about what is the international structure, interdependence, like anarchy. So we've talked about you could have an anarchic structure, anarchy can be an element. Well, interdependence can also be an element of the international structure. Strategic interdependence, so the ability of a state to reach its goals depends on the choice of another state. Actors face mutual costs from ending the relationship, right? So if you want to get something, right, your ability to get it depends on what others do. So, so that means that you need some form of, you need to hope either because it's in their own interest or because of some form of negotiation that the other state will do what you want. And if you end your relationship with the other state, because it'll impact your ability to get the thing that you want, not only will the other state face costs from you ending the relationship, but you'll also face costs yourself. So again, think about, say, a trading relationship, like a free trade relationship, right? And both sides want to kind of maximize their economy, right? Now, So the ability to maximize your economy depends not only on opening up your own borders to trade, but also the other side opening up their own borders to trade. And both sides could only really realize the full gains of free trade if both states take these actions, right? So if one state ends the relationship, either state could choose to do so. Yes, you're imposing costs on the other state, but you're also imposing costs on yourself. Now, interdependence is not the opposite of anarchy. So sometimes people have treated it as, okay, so, you know, neorealism talks about the anarchic international system, and then neoliberal institutionalism is kind of moving away from anarchy because it's talking about interdependence, right? That's not the case. You can have states that are fully interdependent on each other and still live in a world where there's no central authority, right? So saying that there's interdependence or not interdependence isn't necessarily dependent on the level of hierarchy versus anarchy. Interdependence also does not mean that there's a harmony of interests or that power is unimportant, right? So just because states are interdependent, so the ability to get what you want depends on what others do, doesn't mean that you want the same thing. So again, right, ability, again, say you want economic growth through free trade, right? You may, say Canada wants this with the United States, for example, right? Just because Canada's ability to achieve this goal depends also not only on what Canada does, but on what the US does. That doesn't imply that the US wants the same thing, right? It doesn't mean, now, if the US doesn't want the same thing, now possibly Canada can reach an agreement with the US where, by giving some concession, where the US will adopt the policy Canada wants. Again, that's not the same thing as a harmony of interest. It's not one and the same thing, but it's reaching some form of agreement. Or it's possible that the US will just never want it, in which case Canada won't be able to reach its goal. Also, power. It doesn't mean power is unimportant, right? So, for example, again, in the scenario where Canada wants something and the US doesn't, right? If Canada's got sufficient power, it can convince or coerce the US into adopting the position that it prefers, right? So it doesn't mean that power, there's also sometimes when we're talking about independence, there's multiple possible solutions to a given problem, right? So say there's a given problem and two states would like to reach a cooperative agreement so that they can both do better than what they're doing without cooperation. There's multiple cooperative solutions that can be reached, right? Some that country A would like better, some that country B would like better. Which of those agreements are reached may depend on who has more power between the different states. So saying that there's interdependence doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, everyone's in agreement and that power goes away. Interdependence means that actors are linked. While states remain sovereign, their actions are conditioned by the behavior of others. So at the end of the day, each state still has control over what they're going to do, right? So Canada gets to decide, Canada's still sovereign. Canada gets to decide what policy Canada's going to enact. The US is sovereign. The US gets to decide what policies it's going to enact. Mexico is sovereign. Mexico gets to decide what policies Mexico's going to enact. But it means that the choice of policy isn't only based on domestic politics, right? Yes, those domestic politics matter through all the things that liberalism talks about, like so the competition, you know, the commercial, ideational, and Republican side. So what are the preferences of the states, right? Those domestic processes that produce the preferences, yes, they matter. But based on the preferences of a state, the policies that will get chosen to best represent those preferences or the best achieve those preferences are conditioned by what other states do. Because depending on what other states do, your response, your ability to achieve those may be affected. So neoliberal institutionalism is a theory that based on the premise that interdependence is a fact in many situations in international politics. Neoliberal institutionalism was a theory created in the late 1970s, but probably best represented or most commonly associated with a book by Robert Cohen in 1984. Neoliberal institutionalism was a theory designed to address this. So it shares many of the same assumptions as neorealism, right? So the structure of the international system is anarchic, right? So anarchy is still a fact of life. States are rational unitary actors pursuing their self-interest, right? So while neoliberal institutionalism accepts that states can, unlike realism, which just assumes everybody is pursuing security, neoliberal institutionalism allows states to pursue any number of different preferences, but it doesn't care how those preferences are achieved, right? It doesn't look at the process of how those preferences are selected, right? It says it allows all those things to come forward, and then it says, okay, at the end of the day, Canada's chosen this, right? And then based on that assumption, it assumes that the entirety of the Canadian foreign policy apparatus will be pursuing that goal and will be doing so rationally. And the system is characterized by self-help, right? So it doesn't, again, bring in that states aren't have to take care of themselves. They're not interacting with each other out of the goodness of their hearts or because they necessarily want to help each other. All of this is based on the concept of you're trying to protect yourself, you're trying to enhance your own national interest, including survival and security. So it doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden altruistically trying to help others, right? You're still looking out for number one, but looking out for number one sometimes means having to interact with others because looking out for number one, your ability to do so is impacted by others. So here's some of the places where neoliberal institutionalism so it shares many of the same premises, but some of the conclusions reached end up being different. So unlike realism, discord or conflict, remember in neorealism we said self-help and anarchy leads to conflictual or competitive foreign policies, right? Discord doesn't necessarily follow from egoism. Egoism is just another word for pursuing your self-interest. So pursuing your self-interest under anarchy doesn't necessarily mean conflict or competition is inevitable. When mutual interest is low, liberal institutionalism resembles neoliberalism, right? So when there's very little overlapping interests, right? Everything, there's complete disagreement over policy, right? So Canada really wants free trade, US has no interest in free trade, and there's no middle ground, right? Then liberal institutionalism resembles neorealism, right? So there's almost no differentiation between the two theories. However, when there's areas of common interest, cooperation is possible. And so that ends up being kind of the big dividing areas depending on the level of mutual interest, right? So if there's harmony, well then everybody's going to be pursuing, and we'll get into this in a second, if everybody just agrees, then there's no problem. Everybody will be doing what the other one wants without any even discussion. If there's no agreement whatsoever and no possibility of agreement because interests are just completely opposed, well then it's going to look a lot like the neo-realist world. You're going to have competitive policies, power is going to come into play in terms of who gets what they want, and it'll be a conflictual world. But there's areas in between both of those, right, where there's some level of overlap, not a perfect overlap, but there's some areas where they could possibly improve their outcomes. Neither side's getting the best that they could do, and if they work together, they could both improve their situation, where there is some level of common interest. And this is the area where neoliberal institutionalism really comes in. It's looking at how can we get to this cooperation. And we get there partially through the use of international regimes. So international regimes are sets of rules, norms, and procedures around which expectations of actors converge on a certain issue. The convergence of expectations means that participants each expect to play by the same rules, right? So regimes aren't necessarily formal organizations. It could just be an area, a particular issue area. So one regime we talk about is, for example, often is the nuclear weapons regime along proliferation, right? So there's a whole set of rules, norms, and procedures, organizations, all on this particular issue that leads to an expectation of actors to converge on a certain issue. And because expectations converge, because because of these rules and the belief that others are going to be following these same sets of rules or procedures in this area, there's a set of stable expectations that each actor feels like they're going to be playing by the same rules. So it's not like sometimes without a regime, one country feels like they're playing by one set of rules and they believe another country is playing by a different set of rules. So it could be really hard to predict what's going to happen, but also to reach agreements, where if everybody's kind of playing by the same rule book, have the same set of understanding about how behavior is supposed to operate, then we can kind of reach patterned, stable behavior. So international politics frequently involves situations of political market failure. And so this is based on kind of the economics literature on market failure. And really what it means is the self-interest behavior of individual actors fails to produce a mutually beneficial outcome. So it typically, in this case, from the economics example, we'd be looking at, say, the market, right? And typically when we talk about the market, classical economics or liberal economics points to kind of like the Adam Smith notion that everybody acting in their own individual self-interest produces the optimal market, right? That is the best collectively. But there's certain situations where it's been found that if everybody acts in their own individual self-interest, we actually don't achieve the best outcome, right? People could actually achieve better outcomes if, or more mutually beneficial outcomes, right? If they didn't just go in their own individual self-interested behavior. And so some of these that we see in economics, but also in politics, sometimes center around like public good provision, right? So for example, if everybody pursues their own selfish self-interest, right? We end up with no roads, we end up with no schools, we end up with no healthcare, right? Because it's in nobody's real interest to build roads, right? Roads are things that once they're built, everybody gets to share, right? And unless you have tolls on them, you're not getting much economic benefit. So why would you pay to build it if everybody gets to reap the benefit from it, right? What you really need is everybody to contribute towards paying for it because everybody's deriving some benefit, and so the costs are split across it. But if everybody's acting in their own self-interest, individual self-interest, well, what's better for me that I'm better off if I don't pay for it, right? The best situation for me is everybody else pays for the road, I don't pay for the road, and I still get to use the road, right? So I get the benefit of the road at no cost. But if everybody looks at the scenario in the exact same way, then nobody contributes to building the road. Nobody pays the cost of it, but nobody gets the benefits of it. So in this situation, I see everybody is better off, collectively better off. We end up with a better outcome if we don't pursue our own individual self-interest. Because if everybody pursues their own individual self-interest, there's no road. That's the outcome, and that's not optimal. We're actually all better off if we pay a small cost. Everybody contributes to building the road, and we all get the benefit of it. But that's not in your individual rational self-interest. So those are situations of political market failure. And this is where neoliberal institutionalism is looking, how can we try to solve political market failure? So international regimes help to solve political market failure by reducing transaction costs and providing information. Cheating becomes more costly. If we're able to deal with each other, communicate with each other, so reduce transaction costs and provide information, then we're able to reach agreements. So part of the problem that occurs, again, let's go back to our road example, right? So, okay, so we all sit down and we reach an agreement. Everybody's going to contribute a certain amount towards the road. Well, what ends up happening? you know, I might say I'm going to contribute towards it, but at the end of the day, I don't. And I let everybody else put their money into the pile, and it's still enough to, it may be a little bit less than we wanted for the road, but we could still squeeze it out, and I still get to use the road, right? So seating's always the fear in these cases, again, because if I can sit it out, if I can what we refer to as free ride on the efforts of everybody else, I do better. So cheating, defecting from any agreement is always a fear that holds back cooperation on things like building roads, providing defense, any social good. So cheating, but if we have information, if we have a regime that collects information or creates certain norms of behavior, that provides information about what others are doing, right? If the second I try not to pay, everybody else who's contributing finds out about it, they can punish me for not doing so, right? Because I've got information. If we're in a scenario where I could contribute and I could not contribute and nobody would know I didn't do it, well, then we're in a problem. If everybody knows, then they can punish me. So international regimes help by making cheating more costly. So when do regimes help us to avoid market failure? So when, in what scenarios? So I've talked about some providing public goods like a road. But that's just, one example. We'd like to have kind of more general rules about when we expect that political market failure, where individual self-interested behavior doesn't lead to collectively optimal. We refer to them as kind of one of the terms used is Pareto suboptimal outcomes. So outcomes that are not in the collective self-interest, where we could do better by working together. All right, so before we can look at these kind of general scenarios, we often use games to kind of model and show these different scenarios. And so just want to talk through kind of some of these games with you, but first we've got to get down the language of these games. So, and we're going to be using, for the most part, two-player games. Not that international politics is typically just two players, but it's more simple. And then you can scale them up, but for our purposes, it's easier just to look at two. So imagine actor A and B. So it could be two people, two countries, two organizations who are interacting with each other. Both are rational actors. Both have a choice whether to cooperate or defect. So we're also simplifying it down to there's cooperation. You can choose to cooperate or defect. There's no, multiple forms of cooperation. There's no multiple forms of defection. You have choice between whether to cooperate or defect. So if you have two actors with two choices, you have four possible outcomes. A cooperates and B cooperates, and we represent this as CC for cooperate. A defects and B cooperates, and we represent that as DC for defect cooperate. A cooperates and B defects, we represent that as CD for cooperates defects. So we always represent in the CC, DC, CD, we always represent A first and B second, just for simplicity. And then finally, we have A defects and B defects, which are represented as DD for defect. Yeah, so we always list A first and B second. So CD would represent cooperate defect for A cooperates, B defects. And when we're going through different games, you can pause, go back to the slide, or pause the video, return to the slide in your PowerPoint. If we're doing one of the games and you get a little bit confused, absolutely return to it. So both A and B have ordered preferences for these outcomes, right? For all of these four of these different situations. So there's four possible outcomes, and A and B each have kind of an ordering for how they like this. For example, imagine that A's preferences are cooperate. So that's the favored position is cooperate. Second favorite is cooperate defect. Third favorite is defect, and fourth favorite is defect cooperate. And then B's preferences are cooperate defect cooperate, and defect. And then preferred outcomes have higher numbers. This isn't, you do have to be careful if you read stuff using game theory. This next part isn't universal. So the examples I'm using, we put higher outcomes have higher numbers. You'll sometimes see examples where lower numbers are actually the preferred outcomes. So you've got to be a little bit careful here. But in all the examples I'm going to use, preferred outcomes have higher numbers. So again, there's 4 possible outcomes. So 4 is the best outcome, 3 is the second best, 2 is the third best, 1 is the worst outcome. All right, I'm just going to quickly turn on kind of the annotations just so I can be pointing a little bit. All right. So here's a representation of a possible game that you can have, right? So we have actor A here and actor B here, right? So actor A again has the choice between cooperate and defect, represented again as CD, and actor B has the same choices between cooperate and defect. And so this leads to 4 possible outcomes, right? Cooperate, 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 defect, defect, cooperate, and defect, defect, right? So going along here is any outcome where A defects. Going along here is any outcome where A cooperates. Going along here is any are outcomes where B cooperates, and going along here are outcomes where B defects, right? And again, we always represent A's preferences first and B's preferences second. So for example, in this example, A gets its best outcome. So if we just look at A's preferences, right? A's favorite is cooperate, cooperate. Second favorite is cooperate, defect. Third favorite is defect, defect. Fourth favorite or least favorite is defect, cooperate. When looking at B, B's favorite is cooperate, cooperate. Second favorite is defect, cooperate. Third favorite is cooperate, defect. And then least favorite is defect, defect. So how we usually play this in class is I get 2 volunteers for each different game that we go through, and each of them I assign 1 to be actor A, 1 to be actor B, and you know, simultaneously they say what their choice would be, and we see what the outcome is, and then they explain how they made their decision. That's a little bit difficult in this scenario. We've recorded even live in Zoom. We could try a couple of them if you want to try when we do kind of the joint meetings, review of theories, but even it'd be a little bit more difficult. But with each of these games, I'd like you to kind of think of yourself as actor A and think through, what would I choose? And if I were actor B, go through and say, what would I choose? Based on, remember, these are all interdependent situations. Your outcome doesn't only depend on what you do. So if you're actor A, you can choose to cooperate. That is within your choice. But you can't, the outcome depends on then whether B cooperates or defects. So you can choose that it's going to be one of, one of these 2 outcomes, right? But you can't choose which of these 2 outcomes. That's in B's choice. Same thing, if B chooses that B wants to cooperate, it can say the outcome will be one of these 2, but it's dependent on what A chooses as to which of these 2 outcomes it'll be. So always when you're thinking through, you've got to be thinking about what are, you know, not just what is my favorite, but also what are B's favorite? What's B likely to do based on my preferences? And also bearing in mind, so everybody's, you don't only want to be looking at your own preferences, you want to be looking at the others. So always before we advance and I explain the situation more, or kind of give the kind of title to the game, think through what you would do. So right now, think, if you're actor A, what would you choose to do here? Would you choose to cooperate or defect? If you're actor B, what would you choose to do? Cooperate or defect? Right, pause it if you're still thinking, because I'm about to move forward. All right, so this is an example of a harmony situation. Need to sort of bring the spotlight back up. Okay, so this is an example of a harmony situation. So most of you, hopefully, in whether you're actor A or actor B, in this case, chose to cooperate, right? Because let's look through the different possibilities. What does A prefer? What is A's favorite choices, right? Well, if B cooperates, does A prefer cooperate or defect? Well, A prefers to cooperate, right? 4 is better than 1. What if B defects? What does A prefer? Well, A prefers cooperate to defect. So no matter what B does, A prefers to cooperate. And if you go through actor B's preferences, you'll see the exact same thing, right? You'll see that B prefers to cooperate to defect, right? So it doesn't really matter. Both are going to choose to cooperate no matter what the other one does, right? You don't need any discussions. Even if they were choosing independently, both would choose to cooperate. No interventions needed, no discussions needed. Everybody just acting independently in their own self-interest is going to come to the best outcome. No market failure here. No need to have a regime here. Everything's looking pretty good. All right, here's another scenario. Again, actor A, actor B. Take a look at these different options and think through. First, put yourself as A, what would you choose? And put yourself as B, what would you choose? All right, just going to advance it. All right, so probably most of you, hopefully most of you, in either scenario chose defect, right? So let's look through kind of how you could be coming into this decision. So let's put yourself again as actor A, and let's look at, say actor B chooses to cooperate, right? What do you prefer to do? Well, you prefer to defect, right? Your best outcome here, this is your best outcome overall. You're hoping B is going to cooperate, right? You get your best outcome. What if the actor B chooses to defect? Well, you're going to choose to, you'd prefer to be defecting as well. You get a better outcome if you defect as well. And if you look at the scenario, it's the same thing in reverse. If you do go through it for actor B, you're getting the same different scenario, right? So in this case, no matter what the other one does, both actors prefer to defect. Now, they might like to sucker the other one into cooperating because they get the best outcome if the other one cooperates when they defect. But the best possible outcome for both of them is to defect. And so no level of providing information, preventing cheating, no level of discussion is ever going to push the other, either side to wanting to cooperate, to change their behavior to cooperate, because neither wants that, right? Both does better off by defecting. So nothing's going to push them towards cooperating. This is referred to as a situation of deadlock or pure conflict. So international regimes, when are they needed? International, when there's harmony or pure conflict, regimes are not needed. When there's harmony, they're not needed because just based on individual self-interest, they're already cooperating. And pure conflict or deadlock, they're not needed because no level of discussion, they'll both pretty much agree, we don't want to cooperate. Neither of them wants to cooperate based on the situation. Both does better off by defecting. So no regime's going to have, nothing's going to really be able, other than change in preferences, nothing's going to be able to push them towards cooperation. So where are regimes needed? Regimes are needed to solve what are referred to as dilemmas of common interest and dilemmas of common aversion. So we're going to look at examples of both of those now. All right, so this is the first scenario. I'll give the name after, and so think through what you'd like to do if you're actor A and actor B. But just to help out a little bit, because this is maybe looking a little bit more complex, I'm going to give you a scenario for this, a scenario related to kind of the name for it. So think about, so you and your partner, so think you could be actor A and because this is symmetrical, so it doesn't really matter whether you're actor A or actor B. Your decision should be the same. So you and actor B, you're both criminals, right? And you say just rob the bank, and you were arrested. You were caught on the scene, right? But you were after, the next day, police come and they arrest both of you on suspicion of, or at least bring you in question on suspicion for participating in the robbery, right? And they lock you and your partner, so actor A and actor B, both get locked in interview rooms separately, right? So you have no chance to discuss any options with your partner, right? You know that your partner's brought in. You know that they're being presented with options about whether they want to talk to the police or not talk to the police, take a deal and not take a deal. Their partner knows that you've been brought in, but you have no ability to communicate and strategize on what you want to do. So you both are having to make your decisions independently. And so here's the scenario that's presented by the police. They don't have enough to convict based on the evidence they have. So they're hoping for some cooperation. So, but this is a big profile case, so they really want to close it. They really want to get the arrest, or at least get somebody, right? So first scenario, so because they don't have enough evidence, if both of you stay quiet, and stay quiet in criminal world is cooperating, right? You're cooperating with your partner. So if both of you cooperate with your partner and stay quiet, don't talk to the police, they have to release you. They don't have enough. So you both go free. If you rat on your partner, if you talk to the police, if you sing, so to speak, and your partner stays quiet, well, all they really care about is getting one conviction. But it's really good for the career of the police or the district attorney or the prosecutor to get this case solved and get a conviction, right? So they'll actually not only release you, but they'll give you a bonus for maybe a monetary outcome or some protection. They'll drop a charge, another pending charge they might have had on you for something else. So they'll actually give you a bonus for talking. But now for the person who stays quiet, the entire crime is now being pinned on them. So they're getting a big, and it's enough to convict now because you've got a cooperating witness. So they're going to a prison for a long time. They're getting the entirety of the term, right? If both of you are going to prison, maybe the term would have been smaller because it's split between you, but the prosecutor is going hard on this one person. And it's going to be the maximum conviction because they've got all the details. And again, because it's symmetrical, if you stay quiet, right, you don't cooperate with the police. So you cooperate with, you cooperate with your fellow criminal, but he defects from being a good partner. You cooperate with your partner, but he or she defects, right? And he sings to the police, or he or she sings to the police. Well, he goes free and gets a nice bonus, and you're getting the full prison sentence. And then finally, if both of you defect, right, from the arrangement, or from cooperating with the partner. So both of you defect from being a good partner, and both of you sing to the police. Well, now they've got enough to convict both of you. So there's no deal because both of you sang. So it was always contingent on being getting kind of the release, getting the perk was always contingent on just one of you stay quiet and the other talking to police. So in this case, both of you get convicted, right? They've got evidence against both of you, but you get a small prison sentence, right? Because it's split across, the prosecutor doesn't go as hard on either one of you because it's happy to get two convictions, right? So in this case, maybe you get 5 years in jail, where in this case, you get maybe 10 years in jail. So go through again here, both stay silent. Nobody, you both cooperate with the partner and stay silent. Great outcome, you go free. In this scenario, let's go here. In both cases here, both of you defect from being a good partner, both of you speak to police, you both get 5 years in jail. Here, you're a bad partner, so you defect from the partnership, but your partner cooperates, is a good partner. So because you speak to the police and he or she doesn't, you get the nice benefit, so the 4, they get the long prison sentence, the 10 years. And here, you're a good partner, you cooperate with your partner, but they defect from the partnership, they're a bad partner. They go free, they get the bonus, you get the terrible sentence. So what do you do here? Think through, figure out what you would do here. And this game has been simulated thousands of times across different groups to see what people would do. And do people behave rationally? Because there is something clear to do rationally here. So pause it while you're thinking, and then move forward when you're ready. So this game is referred to as the prisoner's dilemma. And there's a clear outcome that you should, if people are acting rationally, there's called what's an equilibrium outcome. If everybody's acting rationally, we end up at defect. And why do we get there? So let's go through again actor A, right? And so let's assume actor B cooperates. What do you prefer to do if actor B cooperates? Sorry, it's B1 and B2 and A1 and A2. It should be cooperate, defect, cooperate, defect. So if actor B cooperates and you're actor A, which outcome do you prefer? Well, you prefer to defect. And what if B defects? What do you prefer? Well, you prefer to defect, right? In either case. But let's look at this defect. Can you do better than that? Could you collectively do better than that? Is this the best possible allocation of joint resources or joint outcomes? No. You both do better off if you cooperate, right? Second best outcome versus third best outcome for both of you. You'd both be better off at cooperate than defect. But if you're acting in your own individual self-interest, you always end up at defect. So the question here becomes, this is where, again, regimes can come in, and this is where neoliberal institutionalism starts looking at, how can we get, if everybody's, this is a situation where we have a political market failure. People acting in their own individual self-interest end up at a suboptimal outcome. We could, if we act in our own individual self-interest, we end up at an outcome where we could both do better. We'd prefer to be here, right? In this scenario, you're both in jail for 5 years. In this scenario, you both go free. This is hell of better. This is better. We want to be here. But how do we get here? Right? And again, this is where fear of cheating comes in, right? Because I could sit across from you and say, again, imagine we were able to communicate. Or if you're just thinking about what the other one is going to do, right? But again, let's go with a scenario where we could communicate before. I could tell you, I could promise you, I could swear on, a beloved family member that, or swear to a deity, I swear to God that I'm going to cooperate, right? But how does the person know I'm not just saying that to try to goad them in, right? Because what's better than me than cooperating, both of us cooperating, what's better to me is I sucker them into cooperating and I defect, right? My best outcome is over here. And same thing, right? How do I know if my partner's saying all the right things about, oh, I'm going to cooperate? How do I know they're actually going to do that? Or they're not just saying that so that they could goad me into cooperating and then they're going to go get their best outcome where I get the worst, right? In both cases, I fear the other side has a legitimate reason to fear the other is going to cheat. So these type of scenarios, and prisoner's dilemma is an example of it, are examples of dilemmas of common interest. And these dilemmas arise when independent decision-making leads to an equilibrium outcomes that are Pareto deficient, meaning outcomes in which all actors prefer another given outcome to the equilibrium outcome. right? So again, oh, sorry, yeah, way too far. Sorry. Okay, so again, here, the equilibrium outcome. This is where we end up acting in self-interest. This is better. We don't end up here acting in self-interest. So we have a common interest to do better or, or to get something else. Pareto deficient outcomes in which all actors prefer another given outcome to the equilibrium outcome. We all prefer the cooperate one. We can agree on that. Pareto's dilemma is a classic example, not the only one. So what do we need to do to escape this? Parties must collaborate together, and all regimes must specify strict patterns of behavior and ensure that no one cheats, right? So these, you need strong regimes, right? You need strong agreements, you need strong provision of information, because while we prefer cooperate, we're always going to be fearful that the other side is going to cheat on us, right? And if there's too strong of a fear that the other side's going to cheat, any agreement will fall apart, because if I feel that the other one's going to cheat, I have to cheat too, or else I get the worst outcome, right? And vice versa. If the other side has any suspicion that I'm going to cheat, they need to cheat themselves. They need to affect themselves to avoid their worst possible outcome. So you need to have a very clear regime that specifies strict patterns of behavior that make sure that no one cheats, or at least if they plan to cheat, that so you want things like strong information about what the other one's going to do. So if the other side's going to be cheating, I know about it in advance, and I could adjust my behavior in accordance. Or things like strong punishment. If they cheat, I have a recourse where I can punish them. So yes, where I would still end up getting the worst outcome, but I could punish them in a way where I could recuperate some of that loss. So say it's an economic agreement where the other side cheats, and so I lose a bunch of money. Well, I could punish them and recuperate some of that money. So that's what you need to overcome this. Anything weaker, say a forum where we could just share ideas, talk could be cheap, and so that may not be enough. Here's another example. So this is one where I'll give you the scenario for this one. So usually in this scenario, I invite up one male student, one female student. It really could be two male or two female, but to go along with how the game's usually presented, do one male and one female student. And the students, once they're chosen and once they volunteer, come up, find out that they are now in a couple together. They're now in a relationship. The scenario is that tonight is date night. So, both of the students, tonight's date night, and so they're both going to be meeting up for a date. Unfortunately, one or both of them forgot their cell phone at home, or it's broken, or battery ran out. They won't be seeing each other during the day. They have no other way of communicating with each other, and they never settled on what they're going to be doing for the date. They had listed a couple of possible options, right? They got down to two options of watching a football game together or going to a movie together. But they never settled on it. And the football game they were going to be watching at home, the movie they were going to be watching at the movie theater. And so, they need to know where they're going to go. And so here's the preference. So actor A, whether male or female student, or male or female participant, right? Their preferred outcome, number one outcome, is that both of them go home or go to the bar. Let's say one's at a bar and one's at a movie theater. They go to the bar and they watch the movie together. Watch the football game together. Second favorite outcome, so they prefer the football game. Second favorite outcome is they both watch the movie together, right? It's not the activity that the person wants to be doing, but it's date night. They want to be doing something together. So even if it's not the preferred outcome, at least they're together. The worst outcome, well, these are such romantics that even the student who prefers, or the person who prefers the movie, is just so distraught if they're at the if they're alone at the movie. And same thing for even the student who prefers the football game. They're so distraught if they're alone that they get zero enjoyment out of other activity if they're alone. The night is ruined, right? So if they end up at different places, right? If one ends up at the movie, the other the football, or vice versa, or ends up at the football and the movie, they're both so distraught that they get no satisfaction out of the night. They have no ways to communicate on where they're going to go. So what do you choose? And this one ends up often being the most fun when we do it, to see what people choose, because it's really like flipping a coin. So it should be 50-50 odds, but what assumptions, other assumptions do people smuggle in, say about who should get what they want, or personality of the student? So it could be a lot of fun. But just based on this, if we have no other information, right, it's pretty much a 50-50 odds that they end up together and getting at least an okay outcome, and 25% odds that they get their preferred outcome. So we refer to this game, this game is referred to as the Battle of the Sexes. And like I said, it's pretty much, 50-50 odds that you get one of these two, 50-50 odds that you get one of these. And while both students, so yes, actor A prefers this one, actor B prefers this one, really the more intense portion of this game is really what they both want to be doing is avoiding these two outcomes. And so we refer to these games as dilemmas of common aversion. So a dilemma of common aversion arises when actors with contingent strategies do not most prefer the same outcome, but do agree that there is at least one outcome that all want to avoid. So they don't necessarily agree, right? Again, in this scenario, they don't agree on which activity they want to do, but they certainly agree that there's at least one outcome that they really, really, really want to avoid. Regimes intended to deal with dilemmas of common aversion need only facilitate coordination. So these are often simpler than regimes to establish, often require weaker setups, often not necessarily even say, dilemmas of common aversion, you may need to set up an entire organization, like a formal organization that has certain powers of, say, information gathering, has certain powers of punishment. Usually in this case, regimes of common aversion require much less stringent rules, right? Because all what you really need to do is get some way where they can communicate and reach an agreement. So again, it might be something less in, when it comes to, for example, airline procedures for flying internationally, right? Each country may have their own domestic rules for, could develop their own domestic rules for how airplanes communicate with air traffic control towers. And that would be fine if there was no international flights. But what happens if each country has their own domestic rules, and then a plane flies into, a Canadian plane flies to the US and it doesn't know the procedures for air traffic control there? That could be chaotic. You also don't necessarily want the plane having to have a list of air traffic control procedures in each country. So what might be more useful? Some form of coordination in terms of these are the rules that are established for everyone. It doesn't necessarily matter what the rules are. It just matters that everybody follows them, right? It could be in terms of what language is used. It doesn't really matter what the language is, right? The pilots could learn whichever language it is, whether it's English or French or German or Mandarin or Arabic. It doesn't really matter. The pilots could learn the required procedures for doing it. What matters is that there's an agreed upon language so that you avoid accidents and you don't have plane crashes. That's what really matters. On a more domestic level, right? Some countries drive on the right, some countries drive on the left. At the end of the day, does it really matter whether it's right or left? No. What matters is that everybody agrees and understands what the rules are. Once it's decided it's right, you're gonna have nobody who's gonna be like, oh, I'm just gonna drive on the left for the fun of it. You may have some great special individuals who might do so, but in general, and at the same time, if it ends up being on the left, right? Some people may have preferred the right at the end of, but at the end of the day, they're all just going to fall in line. What we really just need is a rule. Once everybody knows the rule, they have no problem by abiding by it. We just need a way to establish the rule. We just need a way to coordinate and make sure that everyone's going to end up on the same date, or it's going to be speaking the same language, or it's going to be driving on the wrong side, because either with failure of coordination, people either end up on the wrong date and dissatisfied, we end up with plane crashes, or we end up with car crashes, which are all outcomes that we really, really, really want to avoid. Final scenario I want to look at, because we see some games modeled according to the Stag Hunt, so I'm going to give the name of it right here, because we actually use this as an example to show how certain characteristics, and this could be less fun if we can't play it out, so you can't see how it operates, but we're going to look at some dynamics of games can impact the outcome. So this is a scenario referred to as Stag Hunt. And so we'll start with the most basic two-person game. And so I usually invite up 2 students to participate, and they're told the story of they're out in the wilderness, right? And they didn't bring any food with them, and they're getting hungry. And so they've got 2 options for each person. They could choose to go after the stag, or they can choose to pursue a rabbit for food. Those are the only 2 sources of food in this scenario. Now, rabbits are simple to catch, and so anybody working on their own could get a rabbit. But they're not awesome food. They're small, so you'd get enough food for one night, but you'd have to be going out to hunt rabbit again. You're not going to be particularly full. Stag is a great meal. You'd be getting enough meal for more than one day, or more than one day. You're going to be plentiful meat, and so you're not going to be going hungry at all. But the problem with the stag is that it takes cooperation. Stags are harder to hunt, so you need everybody to be participating in the hunt. So again, let's look at A's preferences. If everybody goes for the stag, they get the stag successfully, and you get plentiful meat. Second best scenario, you go off on your own. So you go after the rabbit, you defect and go after the rabbit, you don't cooperate, you defect and go after the rabbit. And there, you see stag hunt sometimes presented in a couple of different ways. I'm going to pretend that there's no spite element. So you go after the rabbit, you get it yourself, and whether the other person goes after the stag or the rabbit, you have your rabbit. It's not as good as stag, but you got enough to eat. You're fine. Okay, not terrible. Then final outcome for number 1 is here. You cooperate. Sorry, here. Final outcomes here. You cooperate and go after the stag, but the other person defects and goes after the rabbit. So you went after the stag, you find a stag, but you don't alone, you're not able to get the stag. So you don't have food. The other person gets a rabbit, and it's by the time you figure that out, it's too late. You're not going to be able to go after a rabbit. The other person has a rabbit, so the other person is going to be able to eat. You're going hungry. Worst possible outcome. So what do you do? Right? And this game seems easy. When we play it with 2 people, almost every single time, so think about what you would do. It's you and another person. What do you do here? And almost every single time when it's 2 people, they choose, everybody cooperates, right? Because you're better off, right? Why defect? It's just if you work together, you end up with the best possible outcome. So just work together. And so most of the time, this game proves very, very easy when we do it 2 people. But then what we do is, so assume the class could be 38 people, maybe 35 people show up. We do all 35 people play at the same time. And all 35 people are required to get the stag. So now think about the scenario. And so everybody has to cooperate to get the stag. If anybody goes after the rabbit, then they get the rabbit, they're fine, but everybody who went after the stag goes hungry. And there's 35 different people playing, right? So all 35 of you need to go for the stag. So think about, what would you do? And in this scenario, the way it usually plays out, so we can't be doing it together, but I've done it enough times, and every single time we get the same pattern. So I could pretty much tell you how it plays out. What ends up happening is about 2/3, somewhere between 66% and 90% of the class put up their hand. When I say put up your hand for stag or rabbit, and I have them close their eyes so they can't see what others are doing. About 2/3 to 90% of the class go for stag, but 1/3 to 10%, 10% to 1/3 go for the rabbit. And I end up asking them why, and they tell me, well, I was worried that somebody else was gonna be worried, and if they were worried, they're gonna go for the rabbit. And so because I was worried that just one other person was gonna defect, if one other person defects, I need to defect. So it's not even that this person wants to be a cheater or doesn't like the group. If you're worried that someone else is either crazy, so if you worried that either one person is either crazy, and so just doesn't care about the group, irrational, so doesn't understand the game, right? Irrational, they're not able to make the best choice given their incentives. Has different preferences. So again, different preferences shouldn't come in here because we're telling you what the preferences are. But some people misunderstand the scenario and think different preferences. So somebody might prefer rabbit. Vindictive, so wants to screw the group. Again, that would be different preference ordering, so that shouldn't be coming into play here, but people sometimes will give that in thinking. But certainly, irrational could come in here, right? If you believed anybody to be irrational, so either crazy or, to put it, too dumb to understand the game. If you believe that about anybody else in the group, or that anybody else, it may not be a specific person, but believe that there's somebody in the group who may fall into one of those categories, right? And so if you think that person's going to choose rabbit, then you have to choose rabbit. And so it turns out that between 10% and 33% of the group believe at least that there's going to be somebody in there. So that's the first scenario that I bring in. The second, once we're doing the entire group, is I bring in the element of communication. So previously in all of these games, the different people participating were not able to communicate with each other. So I now bring in that the entire group is playing again, but they're able to communicate. And so they're able to speak with each other. They're able to say, ask what everyone's doing. A group leader could maybe try to emerge and try to persuade or coerce everybody into cooperating. And then we play again and how we see. And this one's a little bit split on the groups. Oftentimes the communication is enough to get everybody to choose the stag, or at least diminish the number, although diminishing isn't good enough. On occasion, communication doesn't work. So most of the time when we do the communication model, or we play it again with communication, everybody cooperates. But there is certainly a sizable minority of the time where still usually some people will be persuaded over the cooperation, but not everybody, and still ends up in a failure to cooperate scenario. So communication helps, but it's not, at least in our scenarios, enough. So the lesson here is that when we're talking about many of these games, things like group size, because so far in all of them we've been doing two-person versions. Group size makes them more difficult. Larger the group, the more difficult it is, right? If you're talking about a scenario where you need everybody to cooperate, larger the group, the more difficult it is to achieve. And things like being able to communicate with each other, communication can help improve the prospects for cooperation. Often not enough, because talk can be cheap. So other things may be needed as well, but communication can help improve the scenario. So that's all for this time. Hope you enjoyed it. Wish that we could have been in person together to play some of the games ourselves. It could be a little bit of fun. Maybe not at in the morning, more fun in the afternoon. But still hope that you had fun kind of thinking through some of these different scenarios. So again, yeah, here's the effects of group size and communication. All right, so that's all for this time, and I will see you next time.